Hello and welcome to one of the first tutorials on the Blender logic brick system. In today's tutorial we're going to be looking at a solution to a problem which was posed on blenderartists.org, and the individual in question was asking how could you limit the number of objects added into a scene. Now, although I proposed a Python solution, this is just as easily feasible in logic bricks. First things first, we need to establish a logic controller. To do this, we'll add in our default scene an empty. We'll go into logic view if you're not already, using the control right arrow. Now, we'll add ourselves a message sensor. The reason for this is that if you want to add an object, it all has to interface with the logic controller, and the only way we can do that without using properties is to use messages. Once we've added our message sensor, we'll also add two properties, one called count and one called limit. Both of these should be integers. We'll set count to debug property and limit to the value of 10. Now, in the subject of our message sensor, we'll write request add. We'll also then add a message reply actuator with the subject of request granted. We'll now connect them together, but we'll change the controller type to an expression controller and write message and count less than limit. What this means is that if the message sensor is positive, because it'll go positive and then negative because of the state activating and disactivating. So if it's positive, so it only triggers once, and the count of objects in the scene is less than limit, we'll then reply with a grant request. Now what we need to do is as follows. We can set ourselves another expression controller and write message and count more than or equal to limit. And we'll add a message controller rather, actuator, third time lucky, and this will reply request denied. And we'll connect this to this one. In other words, if the first doesn't trigger, then the second one will. We receive a request to add an object. If it can add an object, it will reply with the permission accepting, otherwise it will reply no. So now we need to go back onto our object which wants to add an object. Go to keyboard center, set it to space, add an and sensor, and now we'll go to the state actuator. And we'll also add a message actuator. So in the message sensor we'll add a request add subject, and in the body we'll give it, or in the state, sorry, we'll give it a add state 2. Now state 2, if we go to visible state 2, and we'll set our first state to the initial state, we'll give ourselves an always, or rather a message request granted, and then we'll give ourselves an edit object actuator and connect that to that, and we'll have it add another object which we can add now, a sphere. Add the sphere if we get a request granted, otherwise we get a message, and if it says request denied, then we need to give ourselves an and sensor, and we'll do the following. So let's minimize these down. We need to add ourselves a state actuator, and we'll set ourselves back to state 1, or rather we'll remove ourselves. I'm not sure if this is the best way, or if we should actually use change to state, but I'm going to use remove. We'll connect this remove to both logic bricks. Now why are we doing this? Well, the reason is as follows. Whenever we receive apply, it's going to be request granted or request denied. Either way, we're going to have to switch back to our main state, but why are we using an entirely different state? Well, the idea is that if we have more than one object adding or removing an object, it means that every time one single object requests to add one, all of the other objects which are listening for messages will add an object to get, if one person presses space, for example, each other object will add a cube. So that would be 3 cubes for 3 objects. Long story short, it isolates it to just this object by switching to this state when you press the keyboard. So that's why this happens. Either way, once we've finished checking whether they add or don't add an object, we then need to go back to our main state by removing this state. And that's how it works. So, we go back to our first state. We're checking all the logic's correct there. Check all the logic is correct here. Now we're going to go to Blender Game, enable debug properties, and just see what happens when we run it. So I need to see what's triggering. So request add. Of course, I've been something very stupid. If we can add an object, then we need to increment it and tell it we can. So we have to add a value of 1 to count if the request is granted. So we're going to move this up in the stack, and that is fine. And now you should see that. So let's make the sphere move so we can see it more easily. In fact, let's make it dynamic. Scale it down a little bit and make the cube no collision. So now when we hit space, you'll see objects falling out. And once we get to 10, we cannot add any more, which works fine. So now what happens when an object ends itself? We need to enable that as well so that the count is reduced. So we add a message sensor. We'll call it remove, and the request remove is the subject. We'll then add ourselves an expression control. Well, in fact, we'll just give ourselves an AND controller and a property of add count, and we'll add a -1. And in fact, we'll just rename this from request remove to inform remove because we're not asking for permission. Now on the added object, we'll give ourselves an example case. We'll add a timer, give ourselves an interval property sensor. So if that time is anywhere between 1 and 2 seconds, because you can't check for a specific more than, unless you use the expression controller, we can then use a message and an N object. Connect these both to that timer. We'll send the message inform remove, and then we'll end ourselves. So after about 1 second, it will end itself and tell the logic holder it's ended itself. Now if you go into wireframe, hit space a few times, you'll see the count decreases, meaning we can keep adding objects provided we don't hit more than 10. So if I go add 10 in a row, you'll see it does that, and that works well. The downsides of this are that you can't actually request to add more than one object from the same object more than once per tick. In other words, one instance of a user adding an object can't do more so than once per frame. But that's not really a limitation. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and learnt it, and we'll carry on the series throughout the year.